for joining us for this virtual self-paced training on beliefs, bias, and bumpers, implicit and explicit roadblocks to trans and LGBTQ welcoming services. I'm Michael Munson, and I'll be guiding us through today's virtual training. Our agenda for today is fairly simple. We're going to look at a little bit of a framework about what bias is and what wholeness is. We'll then look at what kinds of bias there are, techniques for building community, how we can address differences, and then putting some of those things into action. We'll close out with a few resources for additional knowledge and learning. The format for this virtual training is going to be a little bit different than a live webinar. I will be sharing some didactic information, some generalized information about the hows and the wheres and the whats of bias and wholeness. And then there will be intermittent moments of reflection and moments for you to brainstorm. And some of them are 1 minute, some of them are up to 5 minutes. So I'll be asking you to take a moment and reflect on a question. And that might be to think about, a brainstormed list, or processing a challenge that's posed, or thinking through some things, or generating some solutions. So a really simple format. And one of the great things is that you can pause at any point in time if you need to have additional time. So again, this is self-paced, and we encourage you to both take care of yourself and your emotions, since we will be talking about some things that are potentially a little difficult to hear. And the interaction tonight or today or whenever you're listening to this will include those moments of reflection for you to just take a few moments yourself and do the exercises, and then rejoin and listen some more. Let me share with you a little bit about who Forge is, just to give you an idea of where we're coming from. Forge is a national transgender anti-violence organization. We were founded in 1994, so that makes us 26 years old right now. Many of us are headquartered in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but we have staff on both coasts as well. We have about 75% of our time that is devoted to training and technical assistance, and around 25% of our time that's devoted to direct services to transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming survivors and loved ones. Again, we do work across the country, predominantly with providers, and we also have some local engagement here in Wisconsin, where we work both with individuals and with service providers. We have two foundational principles that really guide our work, and hopefully you will see that throughout our time tonight. The first one is to be trauma-informed, and this is something that I always talk about kind of as chasing our tails, because being trauma-informed is always about learning new things and staying up to date on what trauma-informed literature there is and trauma-informed practices there are. So we are really devoted to trauma-informed care, both when we're working with survivors as well as when we're working with providers. The second foundational principle is really about being empowerment-based. And again, I think a lot of times when we think about that empowerment-based, we think about how do we work with our survivors or our clients. But at Forge, we look at it that way, and we look at how do we empower you as a provider to do your job better, to do your job in a more complete way, and to feel empowered to seek more information if you need it, or ask questions, or do whatever it is that you need to do to be the most empowered as you can. We do have a really small staff, so there are some of our staff on the screen right now, and we are generally a happy bunch and a hardworking bunch, but we have a small staff, and we do have a very large vision. So we try to produce a fair amount of work, training, technical assistance, and direct services, and we do so with limited resources. And again, I'm Michael Munson. I'm one of the co-founders of Forge and Forge's executive director. That means a lot of things to a lot of people, but I'm Forge's primary trainer and primary program and project manager of most of the work that we do to make sure that things get done and out the door. So I'm kind of the globalness of Forge, and the rest of our staff have very specific tasks and do a lot of that global work as well. So we're a good tight-knit team. I wanted to share with you early on our social media connections, because we know that in our current day, even pre-COVID, a lot of us connect through social media. So we encourage you to like or friend us on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or on our YouTube channel. We know that this is how we share resources, how we communicate what's new, what's different, and what's upcoming. So we will try to friend you back and be able to share resources in both directions. So I wanted to start us out when we're looking at bias to talk about this kind of from the opposite point of view. So it's a slightly different approach than a lot of people have to talking about bias. So rather than looking at how we work to not be biased, we're going to look at things a little bit from the perspective of how do we create an environment that's respectful and people can feel respected, and how do we create an environment that's whole and wholesome and healthy. When we talk about this, we're looking at things like how do we create organizations and cultures and systems that are fully respected and whole, not just looking at individual bias and individual respect and wholeness. And I wanted to start with this quote, which is from a document that we have on our website called Respected and Whole. And this focuses on kind of that top-down angle and how we're looking at respect from the culture that's created when we have organizations or systems that have respect at the top and that trickles down. So the quote reads, "There needs to be a commitment from the very top to create an environment in which everyone is respected and feels secure enough to bring in all parts of themselves. That means the commitment has to be everywhere, every day. Every person must be respected, from the administrator or executive director to the line staff to the kitchen and cleaning staff. Staff treatment has to model the way you want clients to treat each other." So that's going to be the basis of our time together today, is looking at things from that perspective, even though we will directly look at things from a bias perspective, because that's something that we can understand more easily. So we'll kind of swing back and forth between those two. So when we look at areas of wholeness, I wanted to share with you 7 areas of wholeness. We could probably find, hundreds and hundreds of areas, but these are 7 that are particularly relevant to trans and LGBTQ folks who are survivors and agencies who serve trans and LGBTQ folks. So the first area of wholeness is around policies. Do agencies have a non-discrimination policy? Do agencies have a vision statement that reflects the concepts of respected and whole? Do agencies have employees sign things like statements of acknowledging an organization's vision or mission, or that statement of respected and whole? And your organization may call it something different, but are employees expected to know what that culture is and follow those protocols, follow those attitudes around that culture? Do clients sign a statement acknowledging a Bill of Rights? And that Bill of Rights can be things not just a laundry list, but also including, what does wholeness look like? What does respect look like? How are people expected to treat each other? A second area of wholeness is around procedures. So a lot of times this is really closely related to policies, but procedures are the operational process required to implement the institutional policies. So these are really what makes the policies work. Policies are the kind of what's on paper, and the procedures are what actually happens. So respected and whole is a commitment to, people in an employee handbook, in a Bill of Rights, in some of those places that we see that are outward facing. We might see how procedures work when we do things like do performance reviews of our staff, and we assess their commitment to the organizational values and culture. A third area of wholeness is, what do we do at our agencies around training and empowerment? Do we model the desired behavior in all of our settings? So that's through, do we model it in the training that we do? Do we model it in the staff meetings that we have? Do we model it with how our bosses talk to people who are under them or peers to them? How do we engage with each other to model that desired behavior? Do we engage in staff role plays to practice how we can reduce bias and increase wholeness? Do we engage in things like individual coaching when or if a staff person wishes to have an interaction that didn't go well, go better next time? So can we practice it? Can we coach with somebody who is interested in making improvements with how they've had an interaction or how they witnessed an interaction? Can we reinforce or introduce some tools that people can use? So we know that bias happens in our agencies. It can happen with clients or with staff or with people that are outside of our agencies. And so many times we just don't have the tools that we need. And sometimes other staff members or other people have those tools that they can share with us. The fourth area of wholeness is linking to existing values. So do we have a value in our organizations that everyone is created equal? Kind of like if we look at the US founding documents, do we look at that? Do we have something like that that guides our organization and guides our organizational values? Can we make analogies between the new concept and what we already know or have experience in? Another area of wholeness is around cueing. So how do we let our staff know, how do we let our clients know that our agency is about treating people with respect and treating people with wholeness and healthiness and heartiness, all of those things that we're trying to achieve? Do we have those mission statements, those vision statements posted on the wall? Do we have pictures of iconic symbols that embody those altruistic values? Do we have Tarana Burke, for example, or Martin Luther King, or Laverne Cox, or Harvey Milk, or any number of people that may resonate for you in the type of work that you do as victim service providers, and that would also resonate with folks who are trans or lesbian, gay, or bi? Are there images or motivational quotes or phrases that are on staff people's doors or bulletin boards or visible in that office space that you might work in if you work in a brick and mortar office space? The cueing doesn't have to be subtle. It can be really blatant. It can be a safe space sticker on the front of your door. It can be many different things, but it's got to fit what your organizational culture is. Oops. The sixth area of wholeness is how do we model wholeness? How do we address things when there might be a challenge or a problem or a piece of bias that floats up? Do we have a way to address comments and actions that are not respectful and whole? Do we have a process to do that? How do we model respect and inclusion, even when someone's being hurtful or biased? A lot of times what happens in interactions is we get a little bit biased ourselves when we're responding to a biased situation, even though we know we should, have a cooler head and treat people with respect. It's really critical for everyone else's sense of safety that they know that hurtful behavior will not go unchallenged. So every time there's a biased comment or slur or body movement or gesture, we need to make sure that it's addressed. Doesn't necessarily have to be kind of an over-the-top addressing, but it needs to be addressed every time something happens. And the seventh area of wholeness actually has two different slides because I think it's maybe the most important piece of this, which is amping up the culture. So concentrated and ongoing efforts to notice and acknowledge as many positive actions as possible is really critical to maintaining environments that are respectful and healthy. So how do we acknowledge those efforts that staff are making, that clients are making, that our peers are making? How do we uplift those? One of the things that we heard when we were doing some research a few years ago was having something that was called like a caring squad. So people whose job it is to notice acts of kindness and then reward them. So sometimes we might see this as a rotating basis in a shelter where one person is assigned to notice those positive things, make a comment about it, keep a running list that's posted about it, but they're the person that really overtly tries to notice what is going right about kindness and making sure that people get credit for that. Another piece is to create events that promote inclusion and appreciation of every client. So some organizations have like a Friday fun day, and I don't mean that people are partying, but it might be a party. It might be saying, let's come together on Fridays, if we're like in a residential setting, and every Friday we are going to send gratitude to the people that are sharing our space together. How can we appreciate who people are with their individual quirks, with their individual strengths, as whole people? Another thing about amping up the culture, it's one thing to try to keep an environment that's free of bias and biased remarks and bullying and all of those things that go with it. And it's quite something different to create an environment where everyone feels included, accepted, respected, and able to bring all parts of themselves to the table all of the time. So when we're looking at trans and LGBTQ clients or trans and LGBTQ staff, can they bring their whole self, their transness, their queerness to the table? Can they bring their religious practices to the table? Can they bring all of themselves into the space that they're working in or receiving services in? So let's take a little bit of a breath and let's shift gears to talking about where bias can occur. So I'm going to be using the language of bias because it's the common language that we have, and then we'll flip back and talk a little bit more about wholeness. So what I'd like folks to do, and this is one of the first places where I'd like you to have a pen and paper if you have one. You can pause the video if you need to get some pencil and paper. And I'd like you to think about where bias might occur, where it might happen, and who it might happen between. So we'll give you about 2 minutes to just jot down some answers to those two questions. So when you made your list, I'm guessing that some of these things will have shown up on the list that you made. So where can bias occur? It could certainly happen in the workplace. So that could be in the office spaces. It could be in the waiting areas if you have them. It could be in the restrooms. It could be in the parking lots. It could be in the hallways. It could be in any part of that workplace environment. If you do street outreach, it might be on the streets, which might be a little bit different than on the streets that's listed below here. Bias could occur in public accommodations. So in those public spaces where maybe at a courthouse or at a hospital or in a group setting that might not be in your agency, but someplace else that's a public accommodation. It could happen at home. So clients or staff might be bringing in the bias that they've experienced in their own homes. or it could be in the home of a client that you're working with if you're doing a home visit. And bias can happen on the streets. So it could be the streets that are outside of your agency. It can be what a client is experiencing or a staff person is experiencing walking to or coming into your agency or just moving about the world. We know that bias can happen basically between anybody. So when we look at, and I'm just going to pause for a second. So when we look at who bias can happen between, it can be an individual to an individual. So this might be between a client and a client, a staff member to a client to a staff member, or between two staff members or more than two staff members. So those are those individual interactions and dynamics. It can also happen at an agency-wide level. So there can be systemic bias that's happening. And we're going to talk more about that as we move along. So it could be within your own particular agency. It could be within coalitions that you work with. So multidisciplinary teams, other colleagues from other agencies that you might be on work groups with or think tanks with. There might be some institutional systems that are not your organization, but like if you work with the court system, if you work with the public defender's office or the district attorney's office, if you work with a hospital or mental health care, it could be those institutions that have bias embedded within them. There could be cultural or societal bias. I shouldn't say that there could be. There is cultural and societal bias that all of us experience. And that sometimes blends itself and bleeds into the work that we're doing with our clients and with our coworkers. And of course, there can be legislated systemic bias. So we have laws that are sometimes very biased. And so all of these things are really big and they're a little bit harder to address. But so we've got individual bias and then these more systemic or broader based types of bias. So I'd like folks to spend about 2 minutes now thinking about what kinds of bias you're seeing. So just again, if you have pencil and paper, jot down some notes about what types of bias you're seeing. If you can name about like what is it about that's biased, as well as if it's implicit or explicit. So we'll take about 2 minutes to do that, and then we'll come back and do some sharing. So again, I'm guessing that some of what's on the screen now is similar to what you created in your list when you jotted down some ideas. Some common places where we see bias are around race, which is very prominent and very prevalent. We also see bias around age. So around young folks, around older folks, around millennials. We have lots of names for different people of different age groups. We might see it around religion, anti-Christian, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim. Lots of bias can happen around religion. Might be about ability or disability. Might be about things like economic status or educational status, or being employed or not being employed. It might be about sexual orientation, and it might be about gender identity or gender expression. Many, many, many other things can be examples of bias. That's just a short list, and I'm sure that you've come up with other ideas as well. Those bits of bias can be either implicit or explicit. So one of the things that we know about explicit bias is these are the things that are really easy to kind of figure out. They're the attitudes and beliefs that we have about a person or a group of people that are conscious. We're conscious of the bias that we have against them. And this is really different than implicit bias, which is sometimes called unconscious bias. So the Anti-Defamation League notes that implicit bias is about the assumptions, stereotypes, and unintentional actions, positive or negative, that we make towards others based on identity labels or identities such as race, religion, age, gender, sexual orientation, or ability. Because our implicit associations are stored in our subconscious, we may act out our biases even without realizing it. Oftentimes, our implicit biases contradict our own values. So we don't even realize that we're breaking our own value systems by what we say or do some of the time. So another exercise that I'd like to encourage folks and ask you to step into is I'd like you to think about a time when a client said or did something that was prejudicial. So we've talked, already about where bias might occur, who bias might be occurring between, and what kinds of bias exist. And so now we're going to kind of put this into a real life example. So think of a time with a client. Let's pick a client, not a staff person or a colleague, and think about, one of those things. So a slur or something more than a slur. And I'd like you to just take a moment to briefly summarize what happened in that situation, and then list out what you or other staff members or other clients did or didn't do to address this bias or prejudicial behavior. So summarize and then list what was done or not done. So I'm guessing that you came up with an example and that you came up with things that you did or didn't do. And I want to start out with saying that when we look at bias, it is really hard to address bias. Really hard. I'll say it a zillion times. It's really hard to address bias. Sometimes we have to put ourselves out there, and it's really difficult to do that. Sometimes we worry that we're going to do it the wrong way and it's not going to make a difference. So it's hard. The point is that we try. So sometimes what might happen is that we don't do anything. And I don't want to say that it's okay, but it's understandable, right? It's understandable that sometimes we don't know what to do, or it feels so hot. We just don't do anything. Sometimes we try something and it doesn't work. And that's probably the most common thing that happens, right? Is we try something, we try to minimize or reduce a biased behavior or action, and it doesn't work. Our intervention doesn't work. And sometimes we're successful at addressing the bias. And that's always a good feeling when we can successfully resolve a bias. And again, part of the goal of addressing bias is that nobody ends up feeling badly about it. Like they may feel reflective or conscious of what happened, but the goal is not to make someone feel badly about what they did, just to learn from what they did and make changes to their future behavior. Some of the times we are solely responsible for what we do to address bias. And sometimes we can work together with others to address the bias that happens. When we look at systemic biases that may be taking place, sometimes they can't be addressed with one sentence, one paragraph, like 5 therapy sessions or whatever it is. Sometimes those take months or years to change. Sometimes they take decades to change. And that's not to be negative about what needs to happen, but it takes a long time to create those systemic biases, and it takes a long time to dismantle the harm that those biased structures have created. So another small exercise that I'd like us to do is to think about who's responsible in terms of addressing bias when it happens. So let's take about 2 minutes, and I'd like you to write out as many ideas as you can about who might be responsible when bias occurs. So think of some of the different situations that you might have been in, different configurations of people, different power dynamics, any way that you'd like to think about some biased interactions that you've witnessed or experienced, and then think about who's responsible. And so we'll take about 2 minutes to just let you reflect and jot some of those ideas down. So again, I'm guessing that many of you came up with many of the items that are on the slide right now. So when we look at who's responsible when bias occurs, a lot of times it falls to staff members when it's working within a client setting. The staff member is the one who's responsible to call out, call in, make note of the bias and try to address it. Sometimes it happens with a supervisor, and that could be addressing a client-based bias, or it could be addressing a staff-based bias. Sometimes the person that's responsible is the client, and that could be client to client or client to staff. Sometimes it might be other individuals. So it might be the cleaning person that's down the hallway that addresses a bias that happens between two people who are also walking in the hallway. Might be somebody in the restroom giving a trans person a hard time. It could be any number of individuals who step in and say, hey, this doesn't sound quite right. This doesn't feel quite right. You know, what's happening here is biased. Let's address it. When we look at systems, though, again, I'm not going to read through the list again, but when we look at agencies and coalitions and the structures that we have built in our world, who's responsible is a little bit harder to determine, and how to fix those things that are broken are really hard to determine too. So we could probably spend, a lifetime talking about how to dismantle some of the bias that occurs in some of these systems. And I know many people are working right now to really dismantle some of the systemic bias and prejudice that's happening in our culture right now. I wanted to talk a little bit about when bias starts to feel dangerous. And this can happen at any point in time, but I think especially when we're looking at trans and LGBT people, this may come up a little bit more than some other populations. We know that trans and LGBT folks experience microaggressions on a daily basis, leaving the house, walking out on the street, catching the bus, going to work. There's a lot of, just offhanded comments that are overheard or directed at folks who are trans or lesbian, gay, bi, or queer. Sometimes those escalate to verbal bias, verbal slurs, verbal assaults, negative verbal comments. And sometimes, either the microaggression or the verbal bias, and sometimes it's hard to tell where the line is between those, really leads to the threat or the actual physical harm of someone. And any of those three things, microaggressions, verbal bias, or physical harm, can definitely lead folks to feeling that their life is threatened or that there's impending violence that's going to happen. That may be actual, like a fear that's based on something that may likely occur, or it might be based on a perception or a projection of fear that might be generating that. So when we look at bias and when it feels threatening, when it feels life-threatening to folks, all of us who work in domestic violence and sexual assault are very, very familiar with fight, flight, and freeze responses. We see it in our clients all the time. We intellectually know about it. But when that pattern is happening and people hear that microaggression can go from 0 to 100 in terms of somebody feeling that their life is in danger. And one of these three responses is likely going to happen. To put it in a slightly different way and to look at it from a slightly different angle, a lot of times what we might be seeing is this 90-10 response. So something minor might happen. And so on our good days when we don't get tapped or triggered, it would just be, oh God, that person just said something and it was really ignorant or it was really hurtful, but I'm going to move on with my day, or I'm going to say something to them. And it's not that big of a deal. But sometimes for some people who have experienced a lot of trauma, it taps into something and people have this 90% reaction to something that normally would just have a 10% reaction. So that's what the 90-10 is. So a lot of times we're seeing that with clients where they're having that really, really large response to something that may look to other people as really small. As most of us know, right now is a really polarizing time. It's a very polarizing time in our country. and even across the world. We are seeing an increase in bias at all corners of our country. We're seeing it around race in particular, very strongly about race. We're seeing it about religion. We're seeing it about immigration status. Those are the three that come, I think, to most people's mind when we think about what are the polarizing issues right now. And the other group of folks that really are having a lot of polarization around are trans and LGBTQ folks. Southern Poverty Law Center had noted that in 2014, there was a 30% increase in hate groups since 2014, sorry. 2019, Southern Poverty Law Center noted that there was a 30% increase in hate groups. So we're seeing an increase in the number of groups, Proud Boys, the KKK, many of the other groups that we see. A lot of them are around race, but a lot of them are anti-LGB or anti-LGBT as well. What's happening when there's this culture of polarization is that people feel more emboldened to speak out or to lash out. So people are sometimes hearing our leaders, whether they're political leaders or cultural leaders, say things. We hear it on the news. If we turn on the news at all, we hear polarized language. We hear oftentimes very offensive or hurtful language. We hear it in really political or politicized ways. And we're also hearing things get reflected through religious beliefs. So there's a lot of different ways that we might be hearing about things that are polarizing. And we oftentimes mirror what language we're hearing all the time, whether we are conscious of it or not. So all of us, whether we're leaning towards being biased or not, have a tendency to reflect the language that we're experiencing. People who are struggling may also lash out more. So the people that are experiencing some of that, hearing the news bits, seeing on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram bits of news that are really showing that polarization, may not know how to respond or to self-regulate their emotions, and may lack the skills to emotionally regulate. So those folks might be isolating, they might be depleted of all of their energy, they might feel hopeless, and they may stay in that victim mindset, which is really then hard to imagine healing or imagine a world that is full of hope or full of healing or full of respect or kindness. So let's try and look at some techniques for building community. So I'm going to share just a few of them with you, and then we'll shift to some ways that we can take action. Some agencies have used the techniques of creating community agreements or ground rules, specifically with support groups or shelter or other places where there are multiple people involved in the service delivery or the service system. Oftentimes the collective group of clients, oftentimes commingled with staff, create these community agreements or ground rules together. By doing so, there's a lot of buy-in, a lot of commitment to what those community agreements are. And there's likely going to be a lot more adherence to those community agreements or rules, if you will, when people contribute to making them. So this is one of the ways that we can reduce bias, because we're having buy-in, we're having input, we're asking our clients, we're asking our staff to participate actively in creating an environment that is healthy and whole and wholesome and a place for healing to happen. I'm going to be sharing some quotes with you from a survey that we did in 2016. The survey was asking folks that worked in sexual assault support groups as leaders of those support groups about ways and techniques that they integrated their support groups with regard to gender. So about having gender integrated support groups and what worked or didn't work for them. And so many, many beautiful quotes came out of this survey in the qualitative answers. So one of the things that came out in this survey is this quote about giving the group the responsibility. And this quote reads, "I like for everyone in my group to know that we're responsible for ourselves and to teach each other how this group is going to turn out. I always tell them, I've never done this before. And they look at me like, oh God, this grown-up has never done this before. Person goes on to say, no, I've led a million groups, but not one with you and you and you today, with what's happening in the world today. You know, every day is new. Every group is new. You might be feeling this way this week, and the next week you're going to be feeling a different way, and that's okay. That's kind of my take on connecting people and creating safety and building trust. So if you've seen a few photos already in today's virtual training, and you'll see many more as we move forward, at Forge, we always like to include photos of trans folks, of survivors who are trans, many of whom are lesbian, gay, and bi as well. Many are partners and loved ones. But we really find it valuable to show vibrant, resilient, trans folks and loved ones who just radiate their beauty and their brilliance and their wonderfulness. So another piece of technique that we can think about to help reduce bias is to make our values explicit. One sexual assault support group leader noted that we talk about the central values, like an anti-oppression framework, and creating an inclusive space for everybody. Then we talk about how that happened. I offer some ideas, but often the group members contribute ideas as well. Whenever a new session would start, we would talk about making it a safe space and respecting other people's experiences. So what does it look like when we respect other people's experiences? What does it sound like? Part of this is pointing out to be really mindful of the language that we're using. And that leads to another thing that we're talking about a lot in our culture right now, and that is about sharing pronouns. So when we did this survey in 2016, people talked about pronouns a lot then, but now we see political figures putting their pronouns on their Twitter accounts. We see celebrities doing it. We see professors including their pronouns in their email signature files. We see that support groups have people introduce themselves with their names and pronouns. We see pronouns introduced a lot. So this may not be new to you, but let me share this quote with you anyway about the use of language and the use and importance of sharing pronouns. So this leader says, when we start the group and do introductions, we ask people to identify their pronoun. If there are questions, we explain a little bit more about why we do that, but don't make a big deal about it. We now also ask people to put their pronouns on their name tags, but some choose not to, and we don't pressure about that. It all seems a bit strange at first, but people are getting used to it. And that's really a central thing, is that people do get used to the process of sharing pronouns when it's modeled. So, we talked a little bit about modeling before. When we model that, it goes a long way and people get comfortable with that. Another technique is to point out commonalities. So this advocate said that if somebody had shared a story and then later in the group, somebody else shared a story that had a parallel, as long as it felt like I knew that people would be comfortable, then I might point out the connections. Oh, that's like what this person was saying earlier. Or I wonder if that's similar to what this person expressed or was feeling when they talked about their situation. So pointing out those commonalities is a really good way to help reduce bias, because it helps people see that they're more alike than possibly different. When I present, and especially when I'm presenting live, I always comment about photos that we include, and I just love this photo. This photo is just fantastic of this family group, and just really beautiful. So we just get done talking about ways that people can start to build communities of wholeness and respect, and I'd like to shift us now to looking at how we can address differences. And there are two philosophical approaches that I'd like to share with you, and then a few kind of brief dives into some other additional techniques. So the first philosophical kind of piece, is about normalizing learning. A lot of times I think people think that learning is for folks that are in school, or learning is for young folks. And I know at Forge, we're a learning organization. We really value learning across all of the things that we do. And we really strongly encourage other organizations to really enhance their own learning, to enhance individual learning, and to encourage their staff and clients to also just normalize that process of learning. So this provider stated the following: we start with normalizing and not stigmatizing the process of what happens anytime you learn something new, so people feel comfortable with that. One of the things we talk about a lot was how our brains are neurologically wired for comfort. As humans, we tend to be creatures of comfort. So anytime something is new, it's totally understandable and normal that you may have some apprehension about it or some anxiety. Then we talk about how do you make something not brand new and foreign. So it's really normalizing and saying, hey, when something is new, it feels different. It might feel uncomfortable. It might even feel like you want to run away from it. But when we talk about it and we really kind of dig in a little bit, it's going to normalize it, and it's not going to seem so scary or alien or something that we want to push away. So the second kind of philosophical piece is around rejecting binary thinking. So many of us who work with or around trans folks oftentimes think about binaries in terms of gender identity, or gender expression. All of our culture seems to be really based on binaries, though. We think about Black and white, gay and straight, young and old, many, many, many different binaries that kind of frame the way many people look at the world. So when we start to think about the world and we start to look at the world and see more than two options, it really opens up the door widely to see people for who they really are, and to accept people and celebrate people for who they are. So this advocate shared this quote: "We do a lot of the work on spectrum rather than category. So whether that's talking about safety or even talking about issues related to domestic violence, to not say, here is abusive and here is not abusive, healthy or unhealthy, safe or unsafe. Instead, we present a whole spectrum of what is most safe and what is least safe, along with the idea that things might fall differently in there. We could also do that about respect. We could do that about gender. We could do that about fill in the blank." Having that framework everywhere makes it easier when you have the issue that we traditionally need it for most. It's not a novel idea when we're going to talk about being more open-minded or breaking a box about somebody's identity or gender or sexual orientation, because we've gotten away from the boxes from the beginning. So let's look at a couple of other techniques of how bias can be addressed. Some of these were mentioned in the quotes. You saw them kind of embedded in them. So some of them is, the techniques are to offer or solicit counterexamples. So we can say, oh, I heard this. Does anybody else have a different experience or something that they'd like to share? We can have staff or facilitators confront, which is oftentimes a strong word, or correct, which is a strong word, but step in when they see something biased happened. It could be putting a pause button on it for conversation to happen, or corrective behavior to happen. We can allow clients to handle, and I don't mean allow by as staff people, we're going to just let the clients handle it and we're going to step back. But that might be what clients would prefer. So when we look back at those community agreements, the clients that are receiving services might say, hey, we want to work this out among ourselves, whatever it is. So sometimes that is the best way, is to allow people to handle it themselves, to step forward themselves. We can also be a little bit of a director and say to clients or to staff, here's what's happening here. This is what I'm seeing. How do you want to deal with this? How do you want to address this? What would you like to do now? Some other techniques that we can use is to shift or redirect the focus of things. And I want to be sensitive to the fact that we shouldn't avoid addressing bias. Sometimes we don't need to make a very big big deal out of it. And again, I want to be careful in how I say this, but we want to address it, we want to look at it, and then we want to shift and move on, because sometimes paying a lot of attention to something makes everyone feel worse and nothing get better. So we have to kind of trust our gut and trust our instincts on when it's time to devote a lot of time or help redirect and shape the discussion. We may want to meet privately with somebody, so either with a client or with a staff member, to discuss what happened. So people may not feel comfortable discussing what happened in a group setting or when other people are around. We may want to try to address it privately before we bring it more into a setting where other people are present. We might want to ask overtly, what would help you be more comfortable? So if bias has happened and someone is feeling uncomfortable, whether they're the person that has said or done the biased action or is experiencing it, we can ask those questions and solicit feedback. We can let the client do the educating. So sometimes, clients want to step forward and say, this is the deal. Let me share with you about it. And that leads us to this next quote. And this is one of my all-time favorite quotes about what happens in this particular case when a client steps forward and addresses the bias that happens. So this client says, one time, or this is actually a provider talking about a client. One time a transgender guy, so female to male, was talking about his assaults. He was talking about how his assailant kept grabbing what he was calling his junk. And this cisgender male who was in the group kind of had this look on his face. And so the person who was talking said, hey, my junk might not look like your junk, but it's still my junk. But I think he was kind of just open to the quick little piece of education, and then they just moved on. So let's look at addressing hard situations of what other people are saying. So when we look at overt bias, sometimes these are the easiest things to identify, right? They're the things that are overtly racist or overtly sexist. They're usually verbal, they're usually direct. Sometimes, and probably more frequently, there are things that are more subtle. So microaggressions is a common term for that. They're oftentimes harder to address. I've put in a link to microaggressions.com because there are thousands of examples in there. And sometimes it's good to remind ourselves of what those things are that are microaggressions to some populations that we may not be as familiar with. So I'd like to read you some examples in a few seconds of what some of those things are that people might be hearing. Are there questions that clients ask that you don't have an easy answer to? Do clients make statements that feel offensive? Are clients mirroring peers or society in their biased words or behaviors? Are you wondering what might be, are you wondering how to be more trans or LGBTQ inclusive and also stay focused on the services being provided? So those are just some background questions to kind of, think about as we move through some of the quote examples that I'll be sharing with you. So these are some examples. And so I'm going to show them on this screen and then the next screen, and we'll have a bit of exercise to do with it. So some examples of anti-trans or anti-LGBTQ bias might be, my minister says that those people are predators. Or somebody could say, I'm not going to call him she. Someone could say, you're just sitting on the fence. Someone could say, have you had the surgery yet? Someone else could say, you deceived us. You should have told everyone at the first session. Someone could say, don't tell me I'm prejudiced. I do have gay friends. Or somebody could say, why do you have to flaunt it all the time? So I'm sure that many of you have many examples of what kinds of anti-trans or anti-LGBTQ things get said, either in your groups, in your one-on-one interactions, in your family, on the streets. We all hear these anti-LGBTQ statements said by people that we know or people that are a little bit more removed. So I'd like you to spend a few minutes looking at this list of quotes as examples, or think of another example that you would like to focus on. And I'd like you to brainstorm 3 or 4 possible responses to that statement. So if you were in the presence of the person that was saying this and the person that was experiencing it, what would 3 or 4 different responses be to that interaction? And then from those 3 or 4 possible responses, list out some pros and some cons for each response. So we know that, some things are going to work, some things are not going to work. So think about kind of the tree of like, okay, here's this response. What might be good or what might be not so great about this response? And then ideally, perhaps after this virtual training, you could find somebody to talk to about this example and see what their feelings are and have some discussion about it. So we are going to take about 5 minutes. And again, if you need more time than that, you can always hit the pause button and resume when you're ready. So we'll take about 5 minutes. Great. Well, thank you for doing that exercise, and I hope that you will take some time to connect with your colleagues or other folks about talking about some of these examples and how you can work through and create responses that will hopefully be successful. Before we wrap up today, I'd like to share a few resources with you. Most of these, I think all of them, are Forge resources, just to give you some ideas for some additional opportunities to learn and grow. So the quote that we started out with was from an article that is on our website entitled Creating Safety, Preventing Bias in Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Programs. So it's an article on Respected and Whole. So if you'd like to read the whole thing, it is on our website at the address that is on the slide right now. I wanted to share with you a little bit about the work that we can do for and with you as provider to provider. So we do a lot of training and technical assistance, as I mentioned in the beginning, and that can look like a lot of different things. We do a lot of one-on-one interactions, so people write us, call us, email us, and we engage about a specific challenge that somebody might be having and work through some of those issues. We have many publications on our website. We do trainings. When we were doing conferences in person, we were doing conferences in person before COVID. We have many webinars that are both recorded, as well as we are happy to craft webinars specific to your agency or your coalition. And we do site visits. And again, pre-COVID, that used to be in person, and we are trying to devise some ways of doing site visits that will allow us to do so remotely, because it's possible. We also do work around policy. We're on some different policy committees, both at federal levels as well as statewide and local. We do a lot of collaborating with others, so we would be happy to be your thought partners or work on things with you in collaboration. And we also connect people to information and referrals, both to places that are in your community or other national resources that might be appropriate for what you're looking for. So the work that we do with survivors, I wanted to share with you because you can share them with your clients who might be trans or LGB. We mostly focus on trans folks, but a lot of these resources are very useful for lesbian, gay, and bi folks as well. So almost all of our services are online in the support venues that they offer. We have publications online. Again, we would go to conferences when conferences were in person. We do a lot of work around empowering survivors, and that might be through one-on-one interactions, through emails, through calls, through many different ways like that. And we try to connect survivors or providers who are working with survivors with information and referral to help those clients get their needs met, whatever those needs might be. And we do some direct work with service providers to help service providers help work with their trans and non-binary clients. You can reach out and connect with us at the website that's been on every page, which is forge-forward.org, or my email is on the screen right now, which is mmunson@forge-forward.org. You can also give us a call at 414-559-2123, and my direct extension is #1. The best way to reach me, though, is by email. You'll get a much faster response that way. So just a closing reflection and to wrap us back, kind of pull us back to the beginning of what we talked about today. We talked about respected and whole at the very beginning. I want to restate that when we're looking at creating environments that are respected and whole, which means confronting bias is really hard. It's really hard. And it requires daily practice, and it is everyone's responsibility. So, again, it's really hard. It requires practice, commitment, and it requires a group of people, a village of people, to make sure that we keep on, I don't want to say holding people accountable, but making sure that we don't contribute to a biased environment. So as we leave today, as we close out, I'd like you to think about where you can focus on creating a culture of wholeness. And that might be a culture of wholeness within yourself, which is always a great place to start, within your organization, or within the systems that you work within. Ideally, you can think about where you can focus on creating culture of wholeness within all of those areas. I want to thank you for spending time today with us in this virtual space and doing some exercises on your own, which is not always the most fun thing to do. It's more fun usually to engage in person with folks, but we really appreciate your attention and an interest in working to better serve trans and LGBT clients by reducing bias in individual interactions, organizational interactions, and in systemic ways. So thanks very much.